Hi, this is Lauren. I have a Facebook page and an Instagram called Lauren Makes It Work. And right now, a lot of sewists are making cloth masks. And while I don't have the bandwidth to make a huge production line of masks, I do have the ability to teach. So here we go. This is a 2-layer cotton mask. It's washable, reusable. It does not have a pocket. It does not have a nose wire. However, it fits pretty snugly under my glasses. It is a takeoff of the pattern from Crafty Passion and Mimi G Style. And I altered it a little bit to fit my sewing style. It is also made on a sewing machine and with an iron. However, if you don't have those things, you could easily do this by hand. You would use a running stitch on all the places in construction areas. I use a sewing machine. If you don't have a clothing iron, you would use your fingers to kind of press and give friction to all the different seaming areas that I press. It is also not essential to have elastic. You could use ties, you could use bias tape, you could use shoestrings. This is an opening, a casing, so you can feed whatever you want to feed through it. The reason I like the casing is because it can be cinched a little bit tighter. The other reason I like the casing is because elastic does not last forever, and when this dies eventually, like all elastic does, I can take it out, put new elastic in, or put new ties in, and I can use it again. So that's the how and the why of my mask. That again, 2 layers of quilting cotton around the ears or ties, can be done by hand or can be done with a sewing machine. I hope this helps and makes you feel more confident with the machines and the tools that you've got if you feel like you need to make one of these. And if you don't have an iron or sewing machine, know that you can do this by hand. It might take you a little bit longer, but that's okay. We've got time. And if you don't have a laundry facility near you to wash and dry this frequently, I had the thought yesterday of using a clothing iron. Folks that might be staying in hotels, most hotels have an iron in the closet. You could iron this dry after washing it thoroughly in the sink. That would be another way to be able to reuse this in different settings. And I think that's it. I will post the links of any extra files or patterns or suggestions I might come up with, but this was my way of trying to be helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or reach out. I will answer it as quickly as I possibly can. It's a weird time, and we're all doing this for each other. So stay safe.
I have cut the pattern on the fold, and I'm using a 3/8 inch width seam allowance, or about 9.5 millimeters, to construct the mask. With a stitch length of 1.8 or 2, you want to have small, tight stitches for strength. To save some time and thread, I'm going to feed the next corner of the opposite curve into the machine. Some call this chain stitching, and it can be used in many projects. All of these construction stitches could be done by hand with a back stitch for construction and a running stitch for top stitching. You would still use a 3/8 inch or 9.5 millimeter seam allowance, and what that means is start measuring at 0 from the raw edge of your project. At the 3/8 inch or 9.5 mark is where your stitches should go. So now I have finished stitching the curved edges. Anytime you have a convex or concave curve, you will need to clip in the seam allowance to get that seam to lay flat. Now ideally, you take the point of your scissors and clip through the edge of the item up until your stitching line, but not through your stitches. Now it is time to take it over to the ironing board, or you could finger press those seams we just created either by hand or by machine. For irons, we're going to press the curved seam flat because we want to create that 3-dimensional shape of the curve going across the bridge of the nose and around the chin. This part can be a little fiddly. To press a curve, I found if you lay the curve against your ironing board, Start pressing just around that curve like I'm doing here with the tip of the iron. It's a little easier, and you're really only pressing that 1/4 of an inch area right around the seam line. Now, just to preview, this is what the mask will look like when you turn it right side out. We've got a nice 3-dimensional curve. I need to turn the mask so that the right sides of the fabric are touching each other and the center seams line up at the top and the bottom. These are the seams that are going to be lined up with your nose and your chin once it's complete. We are going to leave about 1.5 inches or about 13 millimeters of an opening near the top of the mask, to the right or the left of the center seam, so that you can turn it like a pillowcase once you're done. The rest of the raw edges are going to be stitched with the same seam allowances as before. Remember, do not sew over your pins. And now we're going to stitch the bottom of the mask. I like to hold on to the tails of my threads at the start so they don't get sucked back into the machine. And after 2 stitches, I'll hit the backwards stitch button just to lock off those stitches at the beginning. I'm stitching as fast as I can while also pulling out the pin before it gets underneath my presser foot. As I get near the end, I'm going to again hit my backward stitch button just to lock off the stitches. You could, however, tie them in a knot if you don't have a backward stitch button. And now we're moving to the top of the mask where the bridge of the nose is, and we're going to leave 1.5 inches or 13 millimeter opening. I'm marking it with pins, but you could use a marker or an ink pen. That's going to be where I restart my stitching, and this is going to be where I stop my stitching, so that we have a little opening to turn the mask. Now, as I get to the first pin, I hit the backwards button to do 3 stitches before I continue to pull out the pin. I lift up my presser foot and pull some slack on the threads, and then lower my presser foot back on top of that next needle or pin, marking the restart of the line of stitches, and begin stitching with 1 backwards and forwards to lock those stitches. Then I continue along the rest of the mask top. Now we have a little opening where you can turn the mask right side out. One more thing that we have to do before we turn it is to clip the curves. There aren't as many this time, and I'm also going to take the scissors and remove some of the bulk in those center seams. Remember, do not clip all the way through your stitching lines. Remove a little bit of the bulk by trimming so that there is just about 1/4 of an inch before the seam, and continue with the other curves and seam at the bottom. Clipping the seams this way ensures that when you turn the mask, your curves will lay nice and flat, and cutting the seam allowance down or removing some of the bulk will keep you from having a bump or a bunch of fabric right at the bridge of your nose and below your chin. Now I'm going to turn the mask right side out through that little opening we created. I've got my handy paintbrush that I keep by my machine for dusting, and I'm going to use it to poke the corners so that they're nice and pointy. I don't want to use anything too sharp because it could puncture the corners of the mask. I'm gently pulling apart the fabric by grabbing onto the printed side, also known as the right side. It's kind of like peeling itself through the opening. I'm using the same force you would probably use to peel a banana, and slowly turning it to the right side of the material, encasing all those raw seams. We're going to do that until we get most of it out, and then I'm going to use the paintbrush through the opening to poke the corners into a nice point. That way we have some nice pointy corners to turn and create a casing for our ties or elastic. Now we have a mask ready to press with an iron or finger press on all those seams you just created. With an iron, press on the side seams so that they're nice and flat. I like to roll my fingers on the seams to kind of pull all the fabric out. When we're ironing, we're reordering the fibers with heat, and as it cools, those fibers settle into their new location. You can let the items stay there and cool, or sometimes I pat it with my hand to absorb the heat, but be careful, it is hot. There we have a three-dimensional curve, and the mask is ready for top stitching. Now we're going to do top stitching. This is one of my favorite tools. It's a measuring guide with all the different measurements on it. It's quick and it's light. The casing is made by folding over the edge 5/8 of an inch or 16 millimeters. Using a measuring device, fold over that finished edge and pin it in place. I'm measuring 5/8 of an inch or 16 millimeters, and I'm going to stitch along the edge that is now folded onto the body of the mask. Starting at the top of that corner of the fold, we're going to stitch right against the edge to create a casing where it is open at the top and at the bottom. As I get to the end of the corner with the sewing machine, I'm going to lower my needle either with the flywheel, turning it towards myself till the needle is in the fabric, or with your sewing machine's needle down function. This allows me to lift the presser foot and pivot the mask at a right angle and lower the presser foot and continue stitching at 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeters top stitching around the edge of the top or bottom. As I get near the other side, I will measure and fold over another 5/8 of an inch or 16 millimeters to create a casing. Pin it in place. Continue stitching with the sewing machine and pivot at the start of the folded casing. Stitch right along the edge. Stop at the corner, lower your needle, pivot again, and continue top stitching the edge of the mask at 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeters. For measurements, I use the inner fork of my presser foot as a guide, but your setup might be different. Once again, lower your needle, pivot your mask, and continue stitching on the edge of the mask at 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeters. Once that's done, you tie a knot or back stitch at the start and end of your stitches, and you have a mask that is ready to have elastic or ties fed into the casing with a bodkin or a safety pin attached to your ties.